Right at the heart of India's constitution, there's this incredible tug of war going on, and it's a fundamental conflict that pits your individual freedoms against the government's big goals for the entire country. In this explainer, we are going to dive right into that very tension. So let's just kick things off with a huge question. What happens when your personal rights clash with the nation's goals? Like, what if the government, trying to do something good for society, passes a law that kind of steps on your rights? And believe me, this isn't some abstract thought experiment. It's a very real dilemma that the Indian Constitution has been grappling with for, wow, over 70 years now.
All right, so let's get into it. This whole conflict, it really boils down to two key parts of the Constitution. Think of them as two massive pillars that are almost always in a state of tension with each other. We're talking about fundamental rights on one side and the directive principles of state policy on the other.
Okay, so on one hand, you've got your fundamental rights. These are like your personal shield, right? They're legally enforceable. You can actually go to court to protect them. They're all about protecting you, the individual. But then, on the other side, you have the directive principles. These are more like the nation's roadmap, or a to-do list for the government. Big aspirational goals like social justice that are supposed to guide policy. And this quote from Dr. B.R. Becker, he was one of the key architects of the Constitution. It just nails the whole philosophy behind these directive principles. He basically saw them as the secret sauce for achieving real social and economic democracy. His point was, what good is political freedom if you don't have economic and social justice to back it up? It's a powerful idea. Now, here's the absolute key term you need to remember, non-justiciable. What does that mean? Well, unlike your fundamental rights, you can't just sue the government because they fail to implement one of these directive principles. They're more like a moral compass, a set of guidelines for what a good government should do, but it's not a contract you can enforce in court. And this one little distinction, oh boy, it's what sets the stage for decades of constitutional drama. And just like that, the great constitutional tug-of-war begins. And for years, this was not just some sleepy academic debate. No way. It was a full-blown power struggle between two of India's biggest heavyweights, the Supreme Court, which saw itself as the guardian of your fundamental rights, and Parliament, which was trying to push forward those big societal goals from the directive principles. So this whole battle played out over like 3 decades. It kicked off in 1951 when the Supreme Court basically said, fundamental rights are king. Parliament's response? They pushed back with amendments. Then in 1967, the court drew a line in the sand, and Parliament fired right back. It all built up to this massive showdown in 1973, and then finally a sort of truce in 1980. It was a genuine constitutional chess match, a real back and forth. And this quote from that Golaknath case, it just perfectly sums up where the judiciary stood. The Supreme Court called fundamental rights sacrosanct. That's a strong word. They were basically saying these rights are sacred. They're untouchable. It was a clear message to Parliament. Hands off. You can't water these down. We don't care how good your intentions are. So how did Parliament take that? Well, they responded with a direct legislative counterpunch. They passed the 24th Amendment, which was designed to do the one thing the court said they couldn't: change, weaken, or even completely remove fundamental rights. The conflict was really heating up now, and it was setting the stage for what would become the single biggest constitutional case in India's history. All of this back and forth led to a huge turning point. I'm talking about a landmark judgment that literally invented something brand new, the basic structure doctrine. And this one idea, it would completely change the game, redrawing the lines of power and defining the absolute limits of what Parliament could do. Okay, so let's break down what happened in this massive verdict. Parliament had passed an amendment that did 2 things. First, it put social goals above individual rights, and second, it tried to tell the courts they weren't allowed to even look at these laws. Well, the Supreme Court said absolutely not. They struck that second part down, saying judicial review is non-negotiable. And then came the knockout punch, the main ruling. Parliament, you can amend the rights, sure, but you cannot destroy the basic structure, the very soul, the fundamental DNA of the Constitution. But wait, the tug-of-war wasn't over yet. In 1976, Parliament came back with its boldest move ever, the 42nd Amendment. And this wasn't about finding a balance anymore. Oh no. This was an attempt to declare total victory. They basically said that any law made for any directive principle would just automatically crush some of the most important fundamental rights we have, like the right to equality and freedom. Well, that was a step too far. This massive overreach led to the final big showdown, the Minerva Mills case in 1980. And it was right here that the Supreme Court finally, once and for all, laid down the law and created this delicate balance that, for the most part, is still the rule today. So where do we land? What's the deal today? Well, the general rule is this: fundamental rights are supreme, period. However, the court did make a very specific exception for a couple of directive principles, mainly the ones that are about preventing wealth from piling up in the hands of a few. If Parliament passes laws for those goals, they can sometimes override the rights to equality and freedom. But, and this is a big but, the ultimate safety net is always that basic structure doctrine. The court's final message was that the Constitution is built on a bedrock of balance. You can't just tear down one pillar to build up the other.
Okay, so you might be thinking, all right, I get it. A balance was found decades ago. Why are we still talking about it? Well, this isn't just a history lesson. This debate is very much alive because it gets right to the heart of what a government is for and what its limits should be. Look, even though you can't enforce them in court, these directive principles are unbelievably important. They're like the soul of the Constitution, its social conscience. They're the blueprint for a welfare state. They guide lawmakers when they're writing new laws, and they even act as a report card for how well a government is doing. They are literally the nation's long-term vision for itself.
But that brings us to the big criticism, right? The elephant in the room. If you can't actually take the government to court for ignoring them, aren't they just, well, empty promises? A nice sounding wish list with no teeth? And you know what? That's a totally valid concern. Critics have long argued that without legal force, they're pretty much toothless. Others say they're not organized very well, and, some of the ideas written back in the 1940s might feel a little out of step with the 21st century. But in a way, this ongoing tension is baked right into their design. And all of this leaves us with one last big question to chew on. That balance, that harmony that was struck in the Minerva Mills case, that was over 40 years ago. So for the India of today, an India that's changing so fast and facing brand new challenges, is that balance between your rights and the nation's goals still the right one? That's not a settled question. It's one the country is trying to answer every single day. Thanks for diving into this with us.